Well, I want to get the perspective of someone who I respect very much, not only because he was a great UNLV quarterback and he got UNLV to a bowl game and he's a friend of the show, but he also happens to be a Metro Cop, and he's a great police officer and a really smart guy. We wanted to get his perspective on what is a very sad day for police officers, not just in Las Vegas, but throughout the country. That would be Caleb Herring. Caleb, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing as best as can be expected right now. Thanks for having me on right now.
Sure, I appreciate it, Caleb. All right, let me start with this because this is the tragic news. What is your reaction? Did you know this officer that was shot? Do you know who it is? And I know there's probably only so much you can say about it, but police have already put out a statement saying that this officer was shot from behind, fighting for his life. I mean, what do you make of this horrific story?
It's tragic. I mean, it's you never want to wake up as an officer to the feeling of having to shroud your badge the next day. The flags half-staff because of one of your brothers fighting for their life or possibly losing their life in the line of duty. It's a sad reality of the profession, but it's one that you never hope you have to face. And personally, I didn't know the officer that is the victim right now and is fighting for his life. But I understand that the community, the brotherhood of law enforcement, is in mourning and frustrated and angry at what is really a senseless act of violence committed against a law enforcement agent, and that's unacceptable in any circumstance. And that's the feeling that you wake up with in the morning when you realize this news, and you see your brothers in blue posting their thoughts and condolences and prayers and hopes for their brother who's fallen in line of duty.
Sure. I mean, do you think this might be a tough question for you to answer, Caleb, as a Metro Cop? But do you think that the National Guard should be deployed at this point?
I think it's a strong consideration. I would hope that it didn't have to get to that. Because there's all kinds of messaging that sends, and you don't want to be at war with yourself in a sense, and that's never the goal. That should never be the first option. You understand the civil unrest, and you hope that local law enforcement is able to handle. And differentiate between those that are peacefully trying to exercise their rights and those that are intentionally trying to instigate violence and incite violence with their own agendas. So you hope that local law enforcement can make that differentiation, but and sometimes you have to use the resources that are available to you, and from a law enforcement perspective, you don't want to be reactive in situations like this, because that unfortunately leads to more situations like this if left unchecked. If that's the direction that it's going, I have no problem with the National Guard or others being used to maintain control and order.
So, Caleb, I try to say this on the show every day because I think it's important. I don't know what it's like to be an African-American male. At the same time, I understand why the majority of the protesters are out there, at least the ones that are not rioting and are not causing trouble. It's not just about George Floyd, right? It's not just about what happened in Minneapolis. It's something that has been going on for hundreds of years. And you could correct me if you think I'm wrong here. It is the fact, in my personal opinion, that it's not just police, some bad actors, some bad police officers, but it's racial injustices that have been going on in this country for hundreds of years. And my co-host JD, he's entitled to his opinions, but he thinks, you can, if you just work hard, you can get what you want no matter what the color of your skin is. And while that might be true to an extent, I think it does diminish why many of these protesters are out here, and that is to make it in this country. I think it is more difficult, no matter how hard you work. I think it's more difficult as a minority in this country. I think that needs to change as well. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think that police brutality in particular, I don't think, and like you said, it's not a singular incident of, George Floyd or Trayvon Martin or, any other situation of police brutality or criminal justice that where the Black or African American community was failed by the system. It's not just one singular event, I think. And I don't even think I would go as far to say that these incidents are as simple as, white guys hate black guys or something like that, or people inherently hate black people, and that's why these incidents happen. I think there's evidence to suggest that racial divides that maybe were the construct of the government of the time, in the time of slavery for economic reasons. The racism was a social construct then, and the remnants of such deep-seated racial injustices at that time have permeated throughout American history and are, in fact, at the root of a lot of American institutes and institutions, and the way that we see government and see the role of law enforcement in the community, there is undeniable racial implications there, and we see the remnants of it in times like this. So the outrage over it is definitely not over a singular event and it's not aimed at a singular individual and his racist acts. And that would be oversimplifying the problem. I think the problem is a systemic emergency, I would say, in the American history that we've ignored for too long. And I think turning a blind eye to it and those facts doesn't help to find solutions. I've mentioned before, convicting an officer doesn't change the system. I mean, the system is set up so that it can withstand and have, another piece to replace it. Whether that piece is a good apple or a bad apple is completely irrelevant to the fact that the system continues to work. And for too long in this country's history, I think African Americans and minority groups in general were the targets of such systems and were capitalized on by those systems, whether it's slavery or the prison industrial complex throughout history. That there's been systems that were in place to oppress and keep minorities down. And I think that has to be realized and addressed in a holistic way and not just through rioting and acting this way or through a simple conviction of an officer who made a mistake.
Oh, Caleb, so there was in Minneapolis when Officer Derek Chauvin put George Floyd in the knee-to-neck restraint. That is actually allowed in the Minneapolis Police Department, and it's the only police department, I believe, that I've seen in the country that's allowed. Can you explain why the knee-to-neck restraint is so frowned upon and discredited by police forces?
Well, there's several other techniques that are frowned upon that all result in the same kind of reasoning, I guess. It's positional asphyxiation. I think that it's known, at least as far as I'm concerned, the way I was trained, that certain restraint techniques may be necessary at a time to gain control over a suspect. But
exactly,
as an
they
officer,
had control.
You're trained to have the awareness that the position that you're putting this person in, hands behind the back, even on their stomach, is one that makes it difficult to breathe. Without having a knee on your neck, if you've ever been in a position where you're face down with your arms behind your back, it already becomes difficult to breathe. Add additional body weight on top of that, whether on the neck or just on the back, it can make it difficult to breathe. I mean, in the sports world even, the dog pile was kind of a thing where people would celebrate by piling on people, and that's actually even a dangerous situation there. So we know that certain things we do as officers put people in compromising positions as far as their health is concerned. It is the duty of the officers, and I don't understand why Minneapolis, I can't speak for their systems and their policies, but I can't understand why this particular position was something that was not departmentally frowned upon to the point where they actually had this as a part of their policy. I don't understand that, and I won't speak to defend that. I do know that it is knowledge, especially in the police department or the police academy that I attended, that positional asphyxiation is a thing that happens, and we have to be aware of that when, in fact, we go to use force, whether it's necessary force or excessive force. We have to be aware that at some point you have to pull back and understand that somebody's position and your impediment of their ability to breathe is important, and that's not what we're here to do. We're not here to restrict somebody's airways and make it difficult for them to breathe and survive.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole situation with the Minneapolis Police Department. You got Philando Castile that happened in 2016. The statistics are showing that African Americans are killed by police officers there at a 13 times higher clip than Caucasians. You had the situation with Amy Klobuchar, who was she ran for president. She was the former prosecutor, and she declined actually giving Officer Chauvin charges because this isn't the first time he's been involved in something like this. Do you think that, considering the fact that they do allow that knee to neck restraint and that this outrage is at least it started with George Floyd, do you think that maybe the riots and what's taking place across the country should be isolated to Minneapolis? Or, I mean, do you agree with it being a nationwide thing at this point? And also, so that's the first question. The second question is, Carmel, Indiana actually just sued the Minneapolis Police Department for their behavior, for the actions, the damage that they sustained in their city from their actions. Do you think that other police departments might do this, or that other cities might do the same thing in the near future?
I think for the first question, I don't think that it, and we touched on this earlier, I don't think the riots and the response that we're seeing are specifically in response to just a George Floyd or that department. I don't think it can be regionalized or isolated to just that singular incident. So containing, I guess, the riots and to that community and that police department, I think don't address it as a national issue that it is, because it's not just there that it happens. This was obviously egregious, and there's been other cases throughout history where it's happened. And I think pointing to something that people rarely talk about is that there was 110 cities after the assassination of Martin Luther King that went to riot for 6 days. And it wasn't until that 6th day that the 1968 Civil Rights Act was passed. And so while I don't advocate for rioting and looting of any kind of senseless violence, I do understand that when the country sees it as an issue, the country can make change. And that 1968 Civil Rights Act gave us a lot in terms of equality. Didn't quite close the gap entirely, but it was in large part, President Johnson signed that act into law because of the riots nationally in response to Martin Luther King. So I think the national stage is what this police brutality issue deserves, to answer the first question. The second question, I would say, it's really tough to say, and forgive me if you could refresh me on the second question.
The second question was Carmel, Indiana. The entire city just sued the Minneapolis Police Department because of damages incurred to their city because of their actions. And talking about Derek Chauvin and obviously not just Derek Chauvin, but Philando Castile and Amy Klobuchar and just a lot of the systemic racism that clearly does exist within that police department. Do you think other cities across the country will do the same thing? Was the question.
Well, okay. So, I don't think that necessarily will be a nationwide thing where other cities and departments start to do that. But I do think I understand that there comes a certain sense of accountability with that kind of action, because if a police department knows or should have known that there's a pattern of behavior that is unbecoming and they have continually failed to act upon it, like you said with the Philando Castile incident and with this incident, the officer who unfortunately ended George Floyd's life had a history of potentially, I don't want to say racially charged motives, but potentially bad policing habits. And if it was failed in the past to be addressed by the department, then yes, these events can be linked as, held responsible by the department. So it makes sense, and I appreciate that sense of accountability. But I don't think this will be a nationwide thing. And I think you would create an even broader chasm between the police that police the community. I think that's one of the biggest issues is if you continue to drive a wedge between the police and the communities they serve, then this us versus them narrative, this anti-police, anti-Black Lives Matter, whatever you want to say, the pitting of citizens and at the end of the day against each other, whether it's with a badge, without a badge, black or white, will continue if you just broadly stroke things like that across. Now, in this case, this department, you can definitely trace that inaction by the department in the past could have, or action by the department in the past could have prevented this incident from happening and thus prevented all the damages that the city is seeing right now from happening. So they have that argument. I appreciate them for taking that step of accountability.
No question. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Caleb Herring, not only a former winning UNLV quarterback, also a winner as a Metro Cop, a really good police officer, and we wanted to get his perspective on that. So, Caleb, I want to ask you about this. Some of the African Americans that I speak to on a regular basis, they say they don't want to hear Donald Trump talk about race relations in this country at all. Just stay out of it. And then I hear other African Americans that are saying, we need more leadership. We need to heal. We need a leader. We need someone to show more leadership. I want to talk to you a little bit about what happened yesterday, and that is the fact that the President of the United States and many on his staff decided to walk a few blocks to a church for a photo op. That's exactly what it is. That's factually accurate because he didn't walk into the church. He didn't open up a Bible. He had a Bible in his hand as a prop. He took pictures for 10 or 15 seconds, and then he left. Why am I bringing this up? Well, because there were peaceful protests yesterday in Washington during the day, and they were pushed out violently by police officers and police law enforcement. I think it's pretty fair to say that that was at the White House directive to clear a few blocks so the president could have his photo opportunity. What do you make of that? What do you make of where the president's at right now when it comes to race relations in this country? And what are some of your friends, African-American minority friends, saying about what the president should or shouldn't do?
Well, I don't want to speak for anybody else other than myself when I say this, and I think there may have been a population of African Americans and people who look like me who share my sentiment. But I would say that from the announcement of his candidacy, President Trump has not had the the most blemish-free history when it comes to race relations. I think that goes back to his time in New York with the whole Central Park 5 incident. So there was a distrust within myself as far as looking at him as far as his track record showed of what he really brought to the race relations issues. And that doesn't mean that he would necessarily have been a bad president or anything like that. That doesn't mean I disagree with all of his policies and other platforms. But when it comes to race relations, I think he speaks from a place of no credibility as far as I'm concerned. This is before the presidency and all that. So this incident, this most recent one, when, like you said, the staged, I guess, photo opportunity, which means little to me. I don't think the voice of leadership that I'm looking for is from Donald Trump, President Trump anyway, when it comes to race relations, because he's simply just out of touch. I think I need someone, I would prefer someone with a more credible history when it comes to the matter. But like I said, I don't speak for the black population by any means. I will say this, that the continued, I guess, narrative that Donald Trump or any president or anyone is going to be the leader of the movement is I think, negative and is damaging. I think waiting for someone else to lead you out of your own situation will always end in more waiting. I think in America especially, we've had civil rights leaders and activists who have fought, bled, protested, and died for civil rights, and yet here we are, the Martin Luther Kings and Malcolm X's and go on and throughout history, and those people that have stood for social and economic justice. But I think the inherent problem is that these problems are more individual than we like to say. And I think at this point in American history, at least, we do have a little bit more individual power to at least make a decision within ourselves to do better, regardless of race and regardless of religious background, whatever. We should be more self-aware of our own mindset and our suffering. And I think that freedom should be sought out before we seek out the leadership of some outside party or some president or any other person for that matter.
Agree. Very well said. All right. I want to ask you this question because I think it's very, very important. Obviously, you're extremely well-spoken. You're a really intelligent guy, and you've done very well for yourself. You have a nice family. You have a good job, and you're very good at what you do. You have your college degree. You're a successful athlete. So for somebody that looks like me, that would look at you and say, well, look at Caleb. He's an African-American. He made it. Look at how well he is doing. If he can do it, any African-American can do it. If somebody says something like that to you that looks like me, what would you say to them as far as being a minority, as an African-American growing up your whole life? What would you say to them to educate them a little bit on how it's not the same for an African-American as it is for somebody that is white growing up in this country?
Oh, it's tough. It's tough to respond to that because I do like to consider myself a success, but I do also recognize that I deal with a certain psychological trauma just for being born the way I was born. And I think even in my own journey, I have been categorized racially. And I think if I use my own life as an example, I've had run-ins with the police in Southern California where I was racially profiled, handcuffed, sat on a curb, just because I fit the description, and the description was a black male. I have been in the field of athletics. I have been racially profiled and typecasted as an athlete and quote unquote athlete. And I've been told that as a black quarterback, it's going to be harder for you to make it in a white man's profession. And that was the profession of playing quarterback. So there still has been hurdles that I have had to overcome. And there's battles that I've had to suffer with silence in order to make it to where I have become. Even today, I'm forced to make a decision every morning and to battle with two very real realities of my life, which is I mourn with the community that I was born into, being a black man, as well as this morning I mourn with the community that I was sworn into, which is the law enforcement community. And I have to face that battle every day when I put the badge on, and being called an Uncle Tom by one side and being called disloyal to the badge on another. And that's the society that we've created in America. So being black in America is a very unusual experience, even among those that are considered, I guess, acceptable examples of making it in America. And I would say you can look through history and the communities of black Americans that have made it in America and been examples of that. You can make it. The Madam C.J. Walkers and the original elite and the original black elite in the early 1900s and the Black Wall Street in Tulsa. These communities were still demonized and torn down. I think people now would look back historically at Martin Luther King and say that he was a successful person. People can look back at the Black Islam movement, whether they agree with the religion or not, and say that that black community was successful and generated a lot of economic growth for the black community, but it is now non-existent. Martin Luther King was demonized during his time, and people fail to remember that. But making it in America as a black man is still a very different experience from being able to achieve in America as a white American. And the avenues that we take are riddled with hurdles and obstacles that maybe by no fault of the people that we currently reside with and the current countrymen that, we share this country with, but the systems of a dark history that has been forgotten,
right,
that are still in place and still play a factor in making it in America. So I would just say to keep in mind the totality of the circumstances that we are all a part of.
Sure, that's my
that
point.
Black Americans are not the only people that are that have been manipulated by the media or by slavery.
Sure.
Black Americans are not the only persons affected by these systems. White America has also been manipulated into believing that somehow the black man in America is the victim and that they're less than, and that me making it as an American is somehow a testimony of courage, when in all reality it should just be business as usual, that a man in America was able to make something of his life.
Right.
No question. I want to ask you this because, and this will be my last question for you, Caleb, and I so appreciate you coming on and talking with us. In our next segment, we're going to be talking about a case where someone who owns a business shot a 22-year-old and killed a 22-year-old, not charged with murder. My understanding of the law is that you're in a business and you don't feel like your life is being threatened, but you feel like your property is being threatened. You are not allowed to kill somebody because it's not self-defense. For example, if 5 or 10 people or one person, doesn't matter, walk into your store and just start stealing stuff, if nobody has a weapon and you don't feel your life isn't threatened, you can't just blast those people and shoot them. Now, if somebody walks in with a gun or a knife or they're torching your place on fire while you're inside, then I think that's different. That's self-defense. Can you give us the law on that? Because that's my understanding of what the law is. If your life isn't in jeopardy, you can't kill somebody because you feel like some of your property is in jeopardy. Is that true?
Well, so much of the law is circumstantial when it comes to the defense of property. I think there does have to be the imminent threat of, or the feeling of the threat of your life being on the line. But it's up to interpretation, I think, by the prosecutors and the attorneys that take on these cases to determine those things and iron those things out. Now, I haven't the case you guys are talking about. I haven't watched it or seen it. I don't know that state's or that locality's statutes on how they approach it. So I wouldn't be able to specifically say, but I do know that there is a precedent for more than just robbery or more than just theft of property from a business. And I don't want to speak definitively on it because I don't, for instance, know off the top of my head. These statutes are very complex, and there's a lot of different justifications for actions when it comes to defense of property and the defense of one's own life. So I don't want to speak definitively. I will, however, say that there are instances of protection of property where we have case law, and we've seen that in the event that you are protecting your property in terms of a business from theft, people have been able to provide defense for and justification for the murder of individuals, and it happened in Southern California during the LA riots, and it was a very popular scene in Southern California when the store owner essentially shot and killed a young black female as she's returning the items that she was suspected of stealing, and she's shot in the back of the head while trying to leave. And that
sure, every case is different.
Served no time.
Yeah, no,
every case
totally
is very different. There's very different cases, so you don't want to speak definitively. The circumstances and circumstances of each case
understood.
Yeah, and how it's approached by law and
understood.
By the legal system.
Caleb, I got it. We're up against a hard break, my man, but I got to tell you, I so much appreciate you coming on. I wish cops out there were just like you. I mean, no question, you're the type of police officer I want to call. When I have an issue or when I'm in trouble. You're so good at what you do. Thank you so much for coming on our show, Caleb, and speaking about these very important issues. We really do appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot, Caleb.
Hey, I appreciate you guys having me on and giving me a platform to speak on it.
Thank you, Caleb. He really is the best. That is Caleb Herring, former UNLV quarterback, and now currently a Metro Cop.